My name is Lena. Please listen to my story fully. It is very special to me, and I believe it will touch your heart. I still remember that night clearly. It was cold, and the wind was whispering softly through the trees. The moon was bright, but the streets were quiet and empty. I was driving my taxi, moving slowly through the quiet roads, watching the faint lights flicker in the distance. My daughters were at home, probably asleep by now. I sighed softly, feeling the weight of loneliness press against my chest. As I turned a corner, I saw a man standing near a dimly lit bus stop. He was wearing a worn-out jacket, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He looked tired, his face slightly pale, and his eyes held a certain sadness. I slowed down and rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice soft but clear. He nodded silently and walked toward the taxi. When he got in, he let out a long sigh, as if he had been holding his breath for too long. "Where to?" I asked. He whispered an address, almost too softly for me to hear. His voice was weak, and he kept looking out the window, avoiding eye contact. After a few moments of silence, I tried to start a conversation. "Long day?" I asked gently. He didn't answer at first. Then, after a few seconds, he nodded. His eyes were empty, and he kept staring at the road. I felt a strange sadness in the air, but I didn't want to push him. As we drove through the quiet streets, the man suddenly spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" he asked, still looking out the window. His question caught me off guard. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were glassy, and there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Yes," I replied softly, my voice barely louder than his. "I feel that way sometimes." He let out a shaky breath. "I lost my wife a year ago," he said suddenly. "Car accident." My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. His voice was filled with pain, and I could feel it cutting through the quietness of the night. "She was everything to me," he continued, his voice cracking. "And now, I'm just walking through life, empty." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence in the taxi felt heavy, but I didn't rush to fill it. I wanted him to have the space to share what was in his heart. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice soft with sincerity. He gave a weak smile, but it was filled with sadness. "Thank you," he murmured. For the rest of the ride, we didn't speak. I just drove, and he stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts. When we reached his destination, he pulled out his wallet and tried to pay, but his hands were shaking slightly. "It's okay," I said softly. "No charge." He looked at me, startled. His eyes filled with tears, and his lips quivered slightly. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice breaking. And then he was gone. He walked slowly toward the small building, his shoulders slumped, and disappeared into the night. I sat in my taxi for a few minutes, staring at the empty seat where he had been. My heart ached for him. I thought about how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. I thought about my daughters sleeping peacefully at home. I thought about the times I felt alone, but I had them. They were my light in the darkness. I started driving again, but my mind kept going back to that man. I wondered if he had anyone to hold him when he broke down. I wondered if he had anyone to call when the night felt too heavy. The next few hours passed by quietly. I picked up a few more passengers, a tired mother carrying her sleeping child, a young couple holding hands and whispering softly, and an old man with kind eyes who talked about his grandchildren. Each person had their own story. Each person carried their own joys and their own burdens. And for a brief moment, they sat in my taxi, and our lives touched as dawn started to break. I drove back home. My daughters were still sleeping, their small faces peaceful and innocent. I stood by their beds for a moment, watching their tiny chests rise and fall with each breath. My heart softened. I leaned down and kissed each of them on the forehead. "I love you," I whispered softly. In that moment, I realized something. I was not alone. Yes, there were moments of loneliness, but I was not truly alone. I had my daughters. I had the people whose lives I touched, even if only for a few minutes. And somehow, they touched mine too. I thought about the man again, the man who had lost his wife. I hoped, with all my heart, that he would find someone to remind him that he was not alone, that he was still loved, that his life still mattered. As I sat down on the couch, I stared out the window at the rising sun. The sky was painted in soft pinks and gentle oranges. It was beautiful, a new day, filled with new chances, new hopes, and new stories. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, and I whispered to myself, "You are not alone." Dear listener, if you are still here, I want to tell you something. You are not alone either. Even in your darkest moments, even when you feel empty, even when the world feels cold, there is still love. There is still kindness. There are still people who care. You are never truly alone. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please like and subscribe. Your support helps me share more stories filled with warmth, hope, and love. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are loved. You said, continue. ChatGPT said. As time passed, I found myself growing stronger. Even though the ache of missing grandma never fully went away, it became a quiet, gentle ache, the kind that softened me rather than weighed me down. The kind that made me notice beauty in the smallest of things. One autumn afternoon, I was walking home from school when I spotted an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. Her hands were frail, and her steps were unsteady. Without thinking, I hurried over. "Let me help you," I said softly. Her eyes widened slightly, and she gave me a warm but tired smile. "Oh, "You're so kind, dear." "Thank you," she said with a voice that reminded me of Grandma's, gentle, patient, and a little weary from the years. I carried her bags and walked slowly beside her. She told me her name was Evelyn. She lived only a few blocks away, in a small white house with blue shutters. She spoke softly, and her voice was laced with a bittersweet longing. "My husband loved blue shutters," she said with a faint smile. "He always said they made the house feel like the sky had hugged it." Her words made me pause. They were beautiful in the simplest, most heartbreaking way. The kind of words people say when they carry love that still lingers, even when the person is gone. When we reached her house, she invited me in for a cup of tea. I almost said no, I still had homework to do, but something made me accept. Maybe it was the way she smiled, or maybe it was the way her eyes, despite being filled with age and sorrow, still sparkled with kindness inside. Her house was small but warm. The walls were filled with framed photos, some black and white, some faded with time. One picture caught my eye. It was of Evelyn and her husband on their wedding day. Her eyes were bright, full of youth and hope. He was holding her hand so gently, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world. I sat down at her kitchen table, and she placed a steaming cup of chamomile tea in front of me. As she poured her own, her hands trembled slightly. "Do you miss him?" I asked softly. She stilled for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. "Every day," she whispered, "but he's still here. You know, in the things he loved, in the way the sun hits the blue shutters, in the sound of our favorite song." Her words pressed gently into my heart, like a feather landing softly on my soul as we sipped our tea. I reached for the locket around my neck, feeling its familiar weight. I opened it carefully and showed her the photograph inside. "This is my grandmother," I said softly. "She used to tell me the same thing. That love doesn't leave, it just changes where it lives." Her eyes softened as she reached out and gently touched the locket. "She was right," Evelyn said with a gentle smile. Before I left, she asked if I would come visit her again. Without hesitation, I said yes, and I meant it. For the next few weeks, I visited Evelyn often. I helped her with her groceries, walked with her to the park, and sat with her as she shared stories about her husband. She told me about the time he spent weeks building a treehouse for their children, even though he was terrified of heights. She told me how he used to sing off-key just to make her laugh, and every time she spoke about him, her eyes glimmered not with sadness, but with the kind of love that never fades. One chilly afternoon, Evelyn pulled a small, worn book from her bookshelf. It was covered in faded leather and smelled faintly of lavender. She opened it carefully and handed it to me. "This was his journal," she said softly. "I want you to read one page." My hands trembled slightly as I took it. I turned to a random page and began to read. "My dearest Evelyn, today I watched you laugh so hard that you snorted like you did when we were young, and it made me fall in love with you all over again. You make the simplest moments feel like magic. If I could live this day with you 1,000 times over, I would. I looked up at Evelyn, my throat tightening. Her eyes glistened, but she was smiling. Hold on to love like that, she whispered. No matter where life takes you, even when people leave, that kind of love never does. When I left her house that day, the sky was painted with the soft colors of the sunset orange and pink, just like it used to be when I sat on the swing in Grandma's backyard. I walked slowly, feeling the cool breeze on my face. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, imagining it was Grandma's gentle hand brushing my hair back the way she used to. That night, I sat by my bedroom window and opened the locket again. I stared at the photograph of my grandparents. I could almost hear the faint melody of their song in my mind. And then, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote a letter. Dear Grandma, I miss you so much, but I'm learning to keep you with me. I see you in the flowers you loved, in the songs you used to hum, and in the kindness of strangers. I met someone named Evelyn today. She misses her husband the way I miss you, but she carries him with her in the stories she tells, in the memories she keeps. I promise I will carry you like that too. I will keep you in the way I smile, in the way I love, and in the way I live. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't disappear, it just finds new ways to be felt. I love you always, Lily. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my grandmother's old music box. I wound it gently and let the soft melody play as I sat quietly, holding the locket close to my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel heavy with sadness. I felt light, like love itself was lifting me up. The next day, I walked to the park. Evelyn was sitting on her usual bench, watching the ducks. She smiled when she saw me. Hello, dear, she said softly. Without a word, I sat beside her and took her hand in mine. She squeezed it gently, and for a while, we simply sat in the golden light, watching the sun melt into the horizon. Two souls, bound by love that refused to fade. Because the truth is, love never leaves us. It just changes form. It becomes the wind, the warmth of the sun, the scent of jasmine on the breeze. It becomes the kindness we show to strangers, the memories we share with others. And when we open our hearts to it, we find that the people we miss are never truly gone. They are with us in every smile, in every sunset, and in every beat of our hearts. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe and leave a like. It means the world to me and helps me share more stories like this one. And remember, love doesn't disappear. It just changes where it lives.